Welcome, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the press call. We'll get started at the top of the hour. All right, so now to the call. Today we'll be hearing from Representative Ted Deutch, and then we'll be hearing from CCL's Dr. Danny Richter. Representative Deutch is the lead sponsor of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, and Danny is CCL's Vice President of Government Affairs. Danny will introduce Mr. Deutch, and then both will have time for remarks. I'll pass it to you, Danny, to introduce Representative Deutch and the purpose of today's call.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here this morning. We're here to talk about the bipartisan Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which was introduced last week and is currently sponsored by 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans in the House of Representatives. The bill lays out ambitious climate change policy that would put a price on carbon pollution and allocate the revenue to Americans as a regular monthly dividend. The Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act goes further than any national policy to date. It is expected to create millions of new jobs, promote energy innovation, and improve public health while lowering healthcare costs. It would also significantly drive down the carbon emissions that are causing climate change. Today, we have with us Representative Ted Deutch, Democrat who represents Florida's 22nd Congressional District. Mr. Deutch is the lead sponsor on this bill, and he'll speak with you a little more about this policy. After he gives his remark, we'll take questions. So turning it over to you, Congressman Deutch.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you. Ted Deutch, I represent Florida's 22nd Congressional District, which includes many miles of coastline in South Florida. I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you about the bill. It's been about a week since we introduced it, and the widespread national support that we've received has really been incredible. As everyone on the call knows, we introduced this bill with Democratic and Republican support, and I'd like to thank my colleagues, Congressman John Delaney of Maryland, Francis Rooney of Florida, Charlie Crist of Florida, and Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, and most recently Congressman Dave Trott of Michigan, who's joined with us. That's what makes the bill, that's the bipartisan support of this legislation, and I think makes it really significant. That the bill is bipartisan, it is ambitious, but it is also realistic. This is possible. It offers a monumental leap forward in the way America responds to the very real and very urgent threat of climate change. Everyone on this call understands that, that the people who support this legislation, members of Congress as a whole, represent communities all across the country. Climate change isn't relegated to one region, one population, one portion of the country, or even one portion of the world. Sea level rise affects coastal communities. It threatens real estate markets, clean water sources, and quality of life. Shorter winters impact seasonal tourism and wildlife behaviors in the north and the Mountain West. Intensified hurricanes are slamming the southeastern U.S. and island territories. There are drier spells that lead to worse wildfires and harsher droughts. Simply put, the status quo isn't sustainable. And frankly, the status quo, if we refuse to do anything, isn't survivable. Now, our bill, the bill's introduction should also take into account the context of the moment, some of the other stories that are out there. The Trump administration's National Climate Assessment found that the consequences of inaction on climate change are dire. A 10% reduction in our national GDP, 9 degrees Fahrenheit warming by 2100. A report last week by the UN Environmental Program showed that greenhouse gas emissions hit a record high in 2017, and that we're not doing enough to limit global warming. And of course, these two follow the major UN study from October, which laid out the very urgent challenges and the necessary changes in order to get our world on track to limit global warming and achieve the 2030 goals. And if all of that isn't enough, we should focus on the news just of this week. A report released by the World Health Organization presented the health benefits that would come from achieving the Paris Accord commitments, millions of lives, and hundreds of billions of dollars saved. There's another report dominating the headlines just today by researchers with the Global Carbon Project that found that carbon dioxide has reached the highest level on record. In 2017, global emissions grew 1.6%. In 2018, they're expected to grow by 2.7%. We also know that the EPA is expected to announce their plan to formally roll back Obama-era rules limiting greenhouse gas emissions from coal plants. So I think that our legislation offers a perfect response to each of these reports. It's projected to reduce carbon emissions in our country by up to 45% in 12 years and 90% by 2050. We put a price on pollution starting at $15 per metric ton, and we increase that price by $10 every year. And then of the fees collected, 100% of the net revenue will go back to the American people. That's a plan that the Treasury Department showed in a report would give lower and middle income families an increase in after-tax income. And after 10 years, if we are not on track with emissions reductions according to the targets set in the law, targets that we expect to be met under this law, then the government will report to Congress and we will reimpose environmental regulations. If we don't act now, we are nearing a point of no return when it comes to the environment, when it comes to our health, and when it comes to our economy. Climate change is complex. It is a difficult challenge, but we cannot be the generation that allows climate change to simply become a runaway train that we refuse to do anything about. We've got to put on the brakes. That's what this legislation will start to do, and I appreciate the interest in it. I'm glad to join the call, Dr. Richter, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Representative Deutch, for joining us. And let's go to the phones now. We'll have a chance for anyone that's curious to have the chance to weigh directly in with Representative Deutch about questions that they have. Quick housekeeping reminder to do that. It's *9 if you're joining us via phone to raise your hand, and we'll call on you in the order we see. Here's the first one that's come in from me, and this is, since you have bipartisan co-sponsors, do you anticipate movement on this bill in the newly bipartisan Congress?
So we wanted to introduce this bill at the end of this Congress to show, going into what will be, as the questioner points out, a newly bipartisan Congress with a Democratic House, a Republican Senate, and obviously a Republican president of the White House. We wanted to show that this is the direction that we need to go, that when you can bring together Democrats and Republicans around an urgent issue like climate change, we can actually start to move to address it. We're going to work really hard to reintroduce this in the new Congress with even more bipartisan co-sponsors, and then to generate as much support as we can to move this forward in the House, looking for Senate supporters as well. Senator Whitehouse has been leading the effort to tackle climate change by putting a price on carbon, a price on pollution. I've spoken to him about this, and we're going to look to try to build bipartisan support there as well. But the reason we wanted to do this now, as this Congress wraps up, is to show that even in this highly partisan Congress, that there is bipartisan support, and that we intend to build upon it in the new Congress with the new composition of that Congress.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Representative. And here's another one that's come through in the chat in the meantime. How would this policy affect the actual middle class?
Well, the difference between the difference between what we're doing here and other proposals that have been floated or ideas that have been introduced in other settings is that 100% of the net revenue from this carbon fee will be returned directly to American families. We think it's the right thing to do. We think it's important because the middle-class families will stand to benefit the most from this. The costs that will be imposed under this bill will be collected and then rebated to them. And the estimates, as I said earlier, the estimates are that over time, middle-income families and lower-income families will actually see an increase in their income as a result of the rebates from this carbon fee.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thanks for all these questions coming in. Keep them coming. Right now, we've got a hand raised as well from a 954 number. I'm going to unmute you and feel free to pose your question to the representative.
Yes, hello. My name is David Lyons. I'm from the South Florida Sun-Sentinel in Fort Lauderdale. I was wondering about, as the revenues flow, from, presuming the whole package passes and revenues flow and whatnot, are there any concomitant plans in the works to essentially fund alternative energy sources so that we don't have this cyclical production of CO2 emissions? I mean, it's one thing to be giving back the tax money to the taxpayer, but if they're spending money on fossil fuels again, it seems as if unless there's some sort of alternative energy plan enforced, that that this particular element of it might be might not be as productive as we'd like.
Sure. Thanks, David. You raise a really important point. This is not, and I don't think it should be seen as the sum total of a congressional response to climate change. The idea behind this Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act is to start to change behavior of polluters. Again, with the dollars going back to individuals, but this is one piece. I think it's a critically important piece, but we need a multi-pronged approach to climate change. We will be looking, we need to, and we'll be looking at proposals to encourage research and development. You mentioned alternative energy sources. I think we've got to continue to find ways from a policy perspective to encourage development of alternative energy sources. We have to focus on resiliency. We're even on the one thing that's been generating a lot of attention going into the next Congress, which is an infrastructure bill, given the widespread acknowledgement that we need to invest in infrastructure in our country. Something that President Trump talked about when he was a candidate, something that a lot of us in the House talked about, including candidates who won tough races, the need for investing in infrastructure. Part of that should focus on modernizing our grid and investing in resiliency. There are a lot of different pieces to this. This is one meant to change behavior and reduce carbon output in one way. And you're right, the flip side of that is making sure that we're making the necessary investments in alternative energy, in solar and biomass, and down in South Florida, especially the research that's being done in generating energy from the ocean. These are all really important and need to be part of the broader approach.
Excellent. We have a New York number as well unmuted, and feel free to take it from there.
Hi, Congressman. Thanks very much for this. I'm calling from the east end of Long Island, where sea level rise and erosion and hurricanes are obviously a great concern. I'm wondering if the failure of carbon tax legislation in Washington state is informing your strategy in any way, and could you talk about why that has failed in what imagine what I perceive to be a rather progressive state. How can you succeed at the national level when the atmosphere there has been so hyper-partisan of late?
Sure. I don't. You're right about the way you characterize Washington. Two different. Well, I mean, there are two different issues that I would just touch on. One is the importance of all of the net revenue going back to American families, going back to consumers through this piece of legislation. And secondly, my understanding from conversations I've had with colleagues from Washington is that there was growing support for that until the last days of the last weeks and days before the election, when some of the largest polluters spent massive amounts of money to try to convince people to oppose it. One of the reasons that it's so important to have bipartisan support and support all around the country is to push back against the false ads and lies that will come, that we fully expect to come from those who wish to continue polluting as they have done, for those who look at a decision to roll back the regulations as a great success for them, and to make sure that we get the truth out there. So it's I think what the example out there tells us is the importance of doing calls like this and speaking up and making sure everyone understands how this is going to work, how it's going to benefit not just the environment, but in going after polluters, changing their behavior, returning money to families. That makes a difference. This is also an effort. I mean, there are different ways to approach climate change. This is an effort that's supported by large segments of the business community, because I know firsthand from South Florida's experience, where sea level rise is such a critical concern. The business community understands that this is an issue we have to tackle, and we have to do it together. So it's going to be a long effort, but the reason we're doing calls like this and the reason we're starting now is because we want people to understand exactly what's in this, how it will help, and make sure that the truth about this ultimately prevails.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. We have a 304 number as well on the line with their hand raised. You are unmuted and feel free to take the floor with your question, 304.
Yeah, this is Tom O'Hara from the Invading Sea. I'm in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Which agency is going to handle the mechanics of this, Congressman?
Department of Treasury is going to administer, is going to handle the imposition of the carbon fee, collecting it and returning it to
and presumably there'll be cost in administering it.
Yeah, there are. We anticipate the cost to be up to 2%, but no more than that. And as I said, the balance, 100% of the balance of that gets refunded.
But 2% of it will be peeled off for administration. Is that what I'm hearing?
Up to 2% as this goes forward, correct.
Okay. And then this increase of $10 a year, what's the mathematics here of the increase of $10 a year and the projected decrease in the emissions of 40% by whatever it is, 2040? How does that work? Who's
well, on that, I can tell you that the increases, we set it at that number initially with the increases in order to change behavior and to get it to change quickly. And the studies that we've received bear out how that will work. I know Dr. Schneider's on the call and may have some more specifics on how the Regional Economic Models Inc. study. They're the ones who produced the report on the carbon fee system, on the details on how they get to it. But from talking to scientists and economists and business leaders, the conclusion, the consensus is that this will reduce, and by having it increase at that level, we'll see these reductions in carbon emissions. But Dr. Richter might have some as well.
Okay, one final question from me then. I mean, you would think that if the polluters are being assessed this, well, for them it's a tax, that they would just pass it along, especially with the understanding that the government is reimbursing everybody for the cost of this. Oh, you know, what's to prevent these folks from just passing the cost along, working on the assumption that, for example, Tom O'Hara is going to get a dividend check once a year, and that'll cover his costs for higher gas bills or whatever.
Right. So the again, this is just based on the modeling we've seen. I mean, the expectation is that yes, initially, as they pay the carbon fee, that carbon fee then gets refunded, and when they fund it, when they pay it, presumably they're going to make a decision about how much of that they can recoup from consumers without affecting their business. Everyone we talk to suggests that it's not a one-for-one. They, as a business model, the idea that they're going to have to drive up costs and expect that that's not going to drive consumers to look for to make decisions to reduce those costs, even though all the money is being reimbursed to them. But the idea that they're going to do that isn't accurate. They can't. Again, this is a conversation I've had with several people, that they can't expect that when they pay the carbon fee, they can simply pass that down and continue to do that 100%, thinking that consumers will be entirely satisfied with what they get back. Consumers are going to be happy to get back the rebate, but they're also going to start to make decisions to reduce their own carbon output. You're welcome.
Thank you, Tom. We have one more question in the chat here. I'm aware that the Congressman has a commitment at the bottom of the hour here. So if you haven't gotten your question asked on the phone, a quick reminder that it's *9 to raise your hand. All right, so here's the last question then for you, Representative Deutch. Thank you again for your time. And this is a question coming from the chat. How do you see it affecting America on the international stage? How does this ripple out internationally?
Well, it's critical to send a message to the rest of the world that America intends to be the leader in taking on climate change and in taking action that can help safeguard our planet. At a time when, on this issue, especially at a time when some question that commitment, given our decision to withdraw from Paris, it's important for them to see Congress taking a significant step in a bipartisan way to reassert American leadership. This is not just, it's good for the environment, it's good to fight climate change, and it's good to assert American leadership in the world. But all of those things will happen even as this benefits America and our economy. We haven't really talked about the changes that we expect to see, the investments that we expect to see in alternative sources of energy. It's not just the behavior of polluters that will be affected, it's the decision making by people who recognize an opportunity to actually help grow the economy by providing alternatives to carbon-based fuels. And that's also going to be an example to the rest of the world. And it has to be done, again, this has to be done in a way that the people of our country understand will benefit them. I'm getting back to the Washington example. It's one, and frankly, we ought to, since I know there are probably people who may be in the queue or certainly are thinking about what just happened in France. France is an example where there was an increase in a tax that was going to be used to help the government. In Washington, there was going to be an increase. There was going to be this new charge that was going to generate revenue to be invested by the government. In our case, this is an effort to take on climate change, generating revenue that we will return to the American people. It'll provide a much better opportunity for buy-in, and then it's not just a buy-in to a carbon fee bill. It's an acknowledgement that we all have to work together to tackle climate change before it's too late.
Thank you so much, Representative Deutch, for your leadership on this critical issue. It's the bottom of the hour, and we'll move on now to hear some remarks from Dr. Danny Richter, but we will have another Q&A section just after that. So keep your questions in mind. We'll open it back up for questions in just a little bit. Danny, I'll pass it to you.
All right, thank you, Brett, and thank you, Congressman Deutch. I want to express my thanks again to you, Representative Deutch, for your leadership on this bill, as well as to the co-sponsors on this bill, Francis Rooney, Charlie Crist, Brian Fitzpatrick, John Delaney, and Dave Trott. We've already highlighted the major positive impacts this bill will have on climate change and on America's economy. Another really important element of this bill is its bipartisanship. These 6 Republicans and Democrats are on board co-sponsoring this bill together. They understand the value of working together. All 6 are members of the Climate Solutions Caucus, an evenly bipartisan group in the House focused on building common ground to address climate change. They understand that climate change is too urgent to get caught up in partisan politics, and the opportunities offered by this solution are too great to pass up. Another important element to highlight about this bill is the incredible support it already has across the country. This policy has the enthusiastic support of Citizens Climate Lobby and our more than 100,000 supporters nationwide. Those supporters are everyday Americans who are concerned about climate change and want to see Congress work together on a bipartisan solution. In fact, most of your newspapers probably service cities that have active CCL chapters. As part of CCL, those supporters have specifically been asking for a fee and dividend style policy like this for almost 10 years, and we will continue working in districts across America to build support for this policy both in this Congress and the next. In the few days since the bill has been introduced, supportive editorials have been written and published by newspaper editors in San Diego, California, Boulder, Colorado, Auburn, New York, Rapid City, South Dakota, and more. Our supporters have already sent thousands of messages to their members of Congress to build additional support and invite new co-sponsors to join onto this bill. This weekend, most of our 420 chapters will host their monthly meeting to plan outreach in their communities, meetings with their members of Congress, and more to support this policy. They're looking ahead at the 116th Congress, since the bill's returning sponsors intend to reintroduce this bill. As more Americans see that legislators are listening and ready to move forward on climate change, the groundswell will only grow. more calls, more letters, more meetings encouraging members of Congress to pass this solution into law. That civic engagement is already making our democracy healthier. With this policy, people and the planet will be healthier too. So this bill and its nationwide support are unprecedented. I'm happy to take questions now about the significance of this bill or any details about the bill itself.
We do have one in the chat here that we'll get to until I see a hand raised, and that is, where does the carbon fee actually start and how fast does it increase?
The carbon fee begins at $15 per ton of CO2 equivalent. It increases by at least $10 per ton per year. In Section 9903 of the bill, there is a schedule for emissions reductions, getting us to a 90% reduction below 2015 emissions levels by 2050. If in any given year emissions reductions fall short of those targets, then instead of increasing by $10 per ton in that year, it will increase by $15 per ton of CO2 equivalent emissions in that year.
Excellent. A little bit more about the CCL chapters as well. Somebody's want to clarify about the coordination across the country, and again, repeating the number of CCL chapters out there. How have they influenced this legislation?
The story of this legislation begins with those 420 chapters and the volunteers who are members of them. So Citizens Climate Lobby has been in existence for, I think, 11 years. We've been focused on this kind of policy for just under 10 years. And we have grown this organization. When I joined as a volunteer, my story is I joined in 2008. I founded chapter number 5 or 6. At that time, it was just about 30 people. And today, as mentioned, there are over 100,000 supporters across the country. For the last, I think, 4 years, they've been going to Congress and having over 500 meetings, around about 500 meetings with congressional offices in a single day. And we have been going to Congress for 8 years. In June, and I believe it's 6 years in November. Constituents of members of Congress paying their own way to share their personal stories about why climate change is important to them, and to ask their members of Congress to act in a way that is consistent with this bill. So again, the story of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act is a story of legislators on both sides of the aisle listening to their constituents who are making personal sacrifices, taking their own time to make their voices heard.
I see we have the South Florida Sentinel here. I'll unmute your line first.
Right. How would the government measure a polluter's emissions footprint, and how would a particular company, say an oil company, get credit for the fees that are paid? And I guess as a follow-on, how would the government cumulatively assess, how emissions are reduced overall, by the collective, reduction in each polluter's footprint?
Yeah. So there are two questions there. The first one, how do we determine the emissions? That is already very well constrained based on fuel type. So based on it turns out that the amount of energy inherent in any given fuel, oil, coal, or gas, is based on how many carbon-carbon bonds there are versus carbon-hydrogen bonds versus carbon-oxygen bonds. That determines its energy density, which determines its value. And so fossil fuel companies have already constrained that a long time ago. But if you know that, you also know what the emissions are going to be. And so this fee would be placed by fuel type upstream in a way that is already very well constrained. And the legislation was written to minimize cost and to minimize the number of people paying this fee, the number of entities paying this fee, while maximizing coverage. And so the idea is go upstream, make it as efficient as possible so that anybody, whether they know it or not, who is using that fuel or whether those emissions are embedded in the good they are buying or the service they are buying, they are going to be paying that cost. So the answer to the first question, that's already very well constrained, and there was an estimate, I think it came from the Congressional Research Service, that I think it was as few as 1,200 to 1,500 entities could be paying this fee. So it would be a very small number. Many of them are already paying some sort of similar fee or tax, and so it would not be the burden. The compliance burden would be very low across the economy. And the second part of that question, could you remind me, what was the second part of that question?
How does the entity know that they're being credited, that they're getting credit for the fees they pay, and that they're, what they're emitted into the air, that they're getting credit for, contributing to the reduction collectively, in the overall?
Yeah, so the legislation specifies that there's a U.S. inventory of greenhouse gases and sinks. So there's an existing methodology by which fossil fuel producers are already reporting their emissions to the federal government, and the legislation specifies that that same methodology would be employed to evaluate how we're doing moving forward. And so those annual targets with that emissions reduction schedule that gets us to a 90% reduction below 2015 levels by 2050, that methodology already exists, and the legislation says that that same methodology should be used moving forward to evaluate how we are doing.
Excellent, Dan. I'm seeing a question wanting to clarify, or at least to have your thoughts added to Representative Deutsch's about the passing costs through to consumers and how that would actually economically incentivize transition to renewables.
Yes, the essence of a market economy is competition. And so while we do expect producers to pass on the costs, if their competitors figure out a cleaner, less carbon intensive way to produce their goods, they will have a competitive advantage. Their costs, they will be able to keep more of their profits, or their products will be less expensive to consumers, and they will win market share. As they win market share, our carbon emissions will go down. So the reason this is a market-based economy and the reason this is going to work is because producers are going to compete, and those who are innovating and finding the methods of production or the ways of delivering services that have the lowest carbon intensity, they will win. They will win market share, and consumers, again, whether they know it or not, will be left with options that are cleaner and greener.
In the meantime, we've got a question clarifying, do volunteers only participate in DC activities? Is there things that the chapters do locally as well? How do those two interact?
There are many, many things that our volunteers do. Going to DC is the headline thing. That's something that, a volunteer who's going to DC is extremely committed. But other things that our volunteers do, they build support in their districts. CCL puts a lot of emphasis on building relationships, both with Congress and with other volunteers in their chapter, with influencers in districts, people who are thought leaders within their communities. Our volunteers are busy making sure that their voices are heard, writing letters to the editor, to newspapers like your own, writing op-eds. They are busy sharing those with members of Congress, submitting letters to members of Congress, appearing at local community events, tabling at, say, farmers markets or any event that they can think of, talking to members of their community, gathering support, and as ever, educating themselves. Most of the time, when our volunteers go into a congressional office, they know more about this issue than the staffer they're meeting with. And that's because of the heavy investment that Citizens Climate Lobby and Citizens Climate Education makes in our volunteers. We want our volunteers to feel empowered, to exercise their citizenship to its fullest extent. And so that's a brief sampling of the different ways that our volunteers are engaging with their democracy.
Okay. One last question regarding the rebate. How is that going to be treated from a tax standpoint for the consumer? Is that going to be is that going to be part of their taxable income, or is there going to be a waiver of some sort?
The legislation specifies, so first of all, a goal of this is to be revenue neutral. And so looking at CBO publications, when you have a policy like CBO Congressional Budget Office, when you have a policy like this, it will be scored as revenue neutral if a dividend is taxable. And so, yes, the dividend is taxable. And because we have a progressive income tax system, that actually makes the impact more progressive. Additionally, there's a provision in the legislation that the income is not taxable for the purposes of means-tested programs. So the purpose of a dividend, what is achieved by a dividend, as Congressman Deutch said, according to that Treasury study, is that you have the bottom 7 deciles, that's the bottom 70%, they basically break even or end up ahead. So the lowest income Americans and a big chunk of the middle class are actually going to have more money in their pockets as a result of this policy than if this policy did not exist. So part of the purpose of this is to help low-income households. And by exempting the dividend from being counted as income for means-tested programs, we make sure that low-income households who could be bumped off of those programs and the benefits they receive are not. So this is very much a policy which is geared towards making sure the poor and the middle class are winners, and there are specifics in the policy that ensure that is true.
All right, so I have one more question in the chat here, but we do want to prioritize phones. So if anyone hasn't had the chance to pose a question here, we're winding down, but we do want to get to anyone that hasn't raised their hand yet. I'm just scanning through here. The question in the chat that I'll ask here then, and if we don't see any more after this, I'll pass it to Steve, is just explaining a little bit more about the limited regulatory adjustment element within the policy, Danny.
Yeah, the limited regulatory adjustment. So I'll explain this from CCL's perspective. We feel very good about this because it is a scalpel, not a cudgel. And I'll give the example of coal. So the scalpel is that it is only those emissions that are subject to the fee and only for their greenhouse gas emissions. So for example, coal, if this were to go into effect, you could not regulate coal for the greenhouse gas emissions once it was burned, but you could still regulate coal for its mercury, for its sulfur, for its effects on streams, for its particulate matter. All of that you could continue to regulate coal for. And you could regulate greenhouse gases that are emitted from coal for instance, their health impacts. So even though you have emissions that are greenhouse gases from coal, if they were also found to be impacting people's health, then you could regulate it based on those health impacts. Additionally, as I said, Section 9903 of the bill lays out a schedule for emissions reductions. If we are not meeting the cumulative emissions reductions by 2030, then the regulations that had been paused come back. And so this has, that is a second environmental integrity mechanism in this bill. The first one is, it is an increase of at least $10, and it could be 15 if we're not meeting that emissions reductions schedule. And the second one, even those regulations which are being paused would come back in 2030 if we have not cumulatively achieved the emissions reductions targets. So that's a little bit about the regulations. It also is explicit in the text in protecting other regulations that are not are not covered. So for example, it protects CAFE standards, tailpipe emissions. It protects the ability of the EPA to grant waivers to specific states for those. It protects the ability to regulate leakage from leakage of natural gas, which major component of which is methane, which is an important greenhouse gas. And it also preserves, as I said, the ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions for example, their health effects. So it is a very, very narrow emission pause in regulatory authority. It does clarify that if we are not meeting these aggressive emissions reductions targets by 2030, then those regulations were paused, even those do come back. And we also another element to that is this is going to beat those regulations. If you look at the Clean Power Plan itself, and you look at the targets that it had for 2030. The Clean Power Plan did include shadow prices, an estimate of shadow prices for each state, and this policy definitely achieves those very quickly in the first 2 or 3 years for every state. And so the Clean Power Plan itself says this policy is stronger than the Clean Power Plan, so we feel good about the pause.
Thanks for speaking to that comparison too in the chat about the Clean Power Plan. Perfect, Danny. All right, seeing no other hands raised, I'm going to pass it to you, Steve, to give us an additional talk about the role for editorials.
So thank you all for being on today's call. My name is Steve Valk. I'm the Communications Director for Citizens Climate Lobby. Before I joined CCL, I worked at the Atlanta Constitution for 30 years. I'm a firm believer in the fourth estate, the role that the press plays in being that fourth branch of government that holds the other branches accountable. This is a time more than ever when your voices need to be heard. We have a solution that both Republicans and Democrats can agree on. And now that this bill has been introduced, there are special interests out there that will put pressure on members of Congress to withhold their support for this solution. So this is where you come in. Your support early on can give members of Congress the courage they need to resist that pressure and do what's right for our nation and the world. If I can be of any assistance, please email me at steve@citizensclimate.org. Again, that's steve@citizensclimate.org. Thank you again for being here, and thank you for the role that you play in making our democracy work.